Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I am your host for today, Ian Fisher. We've got a great show lined up for you, and I'm really excited to share some content across the three different segments that we want to talk about. Before I do that, I want to invite everyone to have a listen to some of the additional college admission podcasts that are out there on the NACAC Podcast Network. Now, NACAC stands for the National Association of College Admissions Counselors, and they've put together a really wonderful network of podcasts all about college admission. If you're interested in hearing different perspectives around the topics that we discuss every day or every week here on this show, you can go to the NACAC website and search for the podcasts on that podcast network. So highly recommend doing that because it can be great sometimes to get some different perspectives and, we always want you to listen to our show, of course, but maybe dabble in some other shows here and there as well. And I wanted to mention that because with our first segment today, we've got my colleague, Kenan Dick, and Kenan used to be an admission officer at Swarthmore College. He's been with College Coach for a long time. And Kenan, I want to welcome you to the show. Thanks for being here today.
Sure, it's been my pleasure.
Now, one of the things we're going to talk about today for this particular segment is consortium colleges. And the idea with a consortium is that you've got, your home college where you attend, and then you also have the opportunity to potentially get some exposure to other colleges at the same time, which is very similar to the podcast network with NACAC, right? You come to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation and do all your listening here, but then you might dabble in some of those other perspectives at the same time. But let's just talk a little bit about the structure of a consortium college, and we'll do a little bit about examples. But for those who are unfamiliar, how best can we describe what a consortium really is all about for undergraduate education?
I think probably the best way to describe it is simply a collaborative effort among different institutions to provide a wider range of services, of opportunities in various parts of student life, whether that's academic, co-curricular, extracurricular, et cetera, and pool those resources together. So what you often will see is smaller colleges that are joining these consortiums so that they can do that and offer more to their individual students than they would be able to by themselves, right?
Yeah.
And so there are a whole range of different consortiums that are out there. I think there's over 100 different consortium agreements. But some of the biggest ones, the most well-known, I think, are the Claremont Colleges, the Five Colleges in Massachusetts, as well as the Quaker College Consortium in Philadelphia. Those are some of the ones that most people kind of think of when they're thinking about this collaborative effort. And I think that as probably the hallmark of the consortium idea would certainly be the Claremont Colleges.
Yeah.
That the proximity of those five campuses all being literally adjacent to one another. You can just think like there's this 3-foot white wall, and you can literally just like flop over to the other side, and now you're on a different campus, and so they're very close. But they also share sports, they share classroom activities, they share different events in terms of recruiting for students. Those kinds of things are all kind of packed together, and so because they are so small, I think the largest one is 1,700 students. They're able to offer a lot more to each of their students because of that agreement.
Yeah, and I think if you took any one of those campuses, and to be clear, it's Pomona, Pitzer, Claremont McKenna, Scripps, which is a women's college, and then Harvey Mudd College, which is focused mostly on engineering, but it has a nice liberal arts bent to it as well.
Yeah.
If you picked up any one of those colleges and lifted it away from the group and just set it on its own, I think in some respects they would feel incomplete. There really is something about the consortium with the Claremont schools that is integrated. And Pomona was my first choice college when I was applying. I thought the consortium was a real advantage of choosing Pomona. And I've been to visit since I started here at College Coach to also have a look at those campuses. And it's really interesting to hear how the students talk about their experiences, not just as a member of their home institution, but also saying things like, yeah, Harvey Mudd's got the best brunch, and Pitzer throws the best parties, and I play intramural flag football with the students over from Pomona. And it's just really interesting how there's a community that's generated from these 5,000 undergrads even though no campus is larger than, the 1,700 that you mentioned.
Right.
Um, why would a student be drawn to this? I mean, are there, real opportunities beyond just having a greater number of students to interact with that come from a consortium kind of model?
I think so.
Okay.
I think that in the case, obviously the one that I know best is the Quaker Consortium with University of Pennsylvania, Haverford, Bryn Mawr, and Swarthmore.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the nice things about that is that because of, especially with the University of Penn being so large, that the opportunities for doing research at or Penn research, all of that I think offers all of these students something that they would not necessarily have access to if they just stayed in their home campus. The other cool thing about it, I think, is that even though these are Quaker institutions and have a very similar ethos, they are still quite different in terms of the campus cultures.
Yeah.
And so the people that you meet, the people that are in your classes in these collaborative classroom environments, really do kind of expand your horizons in a way that I think is tangible. So I think that they do really offer something in a way. Being part of these consortiums offer something to students that you would not get for these small schools that are kind of insular.
That's actually a great point because, in visiting some of these campuses, I think it's very interesting how they really lean into the things that they're really good at. Like if you would think that if you walk from Claremont McKenna up to Harvey Mudd, that you're really feeling like you're a part of one campus, but
Yep.
you can feel the change in terms of the architecture and in terms of the personality of the students. And I think what's really interesting is it allows those institutions as individuals to really figure out what it's best at and to
Mhm.
cultivate that strength because there's the knowledge that you have access to these other consortiums at the same time. And one of the things I think that is really notable with the Quaker Consortium, with the Five Colleges in Amherst, Massachusetts, and with the Claremont schools is each of them has a women's college or at least one women's college. In the case of the Five Colleges, we've got both Smith and Mount Holyoke
Mhm.
as a part of that group. And that's a really interesting component to the consortiums as well, especially if you're a student that's thinking about going to a women's college, but you don't want to only go to a women's college, you want access to the consortium. Did you see some of that in terms of students as they were thinking about Bryn Mawr, maybe rolling Swarthmore into that conversation?
Absolutely, and I think that I think that it gave the students at Bryn Mawr the option of being in classroom environment with the vast majority of women, right?
Sure.
And so that classroom environment was considerably different from the other campuses. And so the benefits of going to an all women's college was kind of protected in that institution, but you also had access to these other schools, right? So if you wanted to take classes that Bryn Mawr did not necessarily offer, you still had that option to go to those schools and take that set of coursework. So I think that that's a great note. Is that the as a student who's interested in women's colleges, it really does offer kind of the best of both worlds in my mind, and offer a lot of opportunities that might not be otherwise offered.
I also think about it as I don't know if my teenage self would have had this view, but as somebody who is a man in education, we work mostly with women all day.
Hmm.
We're sort of in the minority as far as gender is concerned,
Hmm.
and I like that environment. I mean, I think that it's
Hmm.
actually really great. And so the idea of being um, a college male at Pomona, but getting to take a class at Scripps where most of the other students in the class are women, I think
Hmm.
creates a really interesting learning experience as well. Um, and so there's an opportunity there, I think, even for young men to think about, hey, I can experience a women's college in some respect in terms of the coursework in a way that I
Yep.
wouldn't be able to do outside of this consortium. Uh,
Certainly goes both ways. Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. Um, what do we think about, like these consortiums? I think they've got a lot of really great advantages for students to pick up on. Are there disadvantages? Is there a sense of, a lack of maybe clear identity with that school because you feel like you're matched up more with the consortium? Is it just trying to keep track of all of these different rules and systems and regulate? Like, are there any drawbacks that you could see in your time working at Swarthmore that affected students because of the consortium, or is it just positive?
I only saw positives. I really didn't see any downside to it. The only potential downside that I could point to would be depending upon the proximity, and this is why you see a lot more um, interchange, especially in class sharing between Haverford and Bryn Mawr, was because they're half a mile apart, right?
Yeah.
And so you could get to a 10 o'clock class at Haverford, and then back to your 11 o'clock class at Bryn Mawr.
Wow.
You can't really do that with Haverford and Swarthmore, for instance, because there's a shuttle, takes 20 minutes, that kind of thing. There's a train ride into Philadelphia for Penn classes, so that's going to be significant in terms of how you manage that scheduling.
Yeah.
But certainly with the Claremont group, as well as some of the schools in Amherst, there can be those types of challenges, but I think that's pretty much the only downside that I've seen in terms of the the institutional sharing of resources. Um, yeah,
I think there that, and then also I think that there is a potential for a student to say, "Hey, I'm going to go to this school, and then I'm going to have the opportunity to take lots of classes at this other institution." And it might not actually be the case that they're able to do as much as they hope that they could, right? So
correct.
I remember being on the Pomona tour. Oh my gosh, I don't even know how many years ago it was at this point. Probably
Hmm.
20. And asking the tour guide, it was like, so if I take math, do I go over to Harvey Mudd for my math classes? And he was like, well, no, Pomona's got great math instructors as well. So you don't necessarily go there. But I was already, as a prospective student, thinking, all right, I'm going to take this class at Claremont McKenna, I'm going to take this one at Pitzer, and this one at, and really you do take the majority of your classes at your home institution because they're the one that's granting you that degree. And so
Makes sense.
sometimes the dreams that you have about this cross registration might not be able to come to fruition because of logistics or because of expectations of your particular home campus. Um,
Hmm.
Kenan, what about students who are, this sounds appealing, right? This is a cool
Yep.
option, and
Hmm.
they're starting to look at it in the research phase. How do students think about applying to a consortium school? I mean, are they saying, look, I'm really interested in the consortium, and so I'm going to look at the 5 colleges and I'm going to apply to all 5? Or do they usually find one and the consortium is an added feature of the one that they like? How do you find that students typically engage with that question?
It's been my experience that most of the time students are focused on one institution of that group. And typically it's because, as you pointed out earlier, that if you think about, the Claremont or the Quaker Consortium, or especially the Amherst Consortium, the differences among the students culturally in those campuses can be pretty significant. And the selectivity of some of those campuses can also be pretty significant and different from one another. It's a lot different to try to get into UMass Amherst than it is to get into Amherst College. And so part of what they usually will focus on is which of those 5 is the best match for me, and then think about how that set of resources can expand my horizons if I wish it to.
Mhm.
But I think most students that I've worked with that are focused on these types of campuses are thinking about the home campus primarily.
Yeah,
And the consortium is kind of the icing on the cake.
I think that tends to be true. Do you ever discourage students who are looking at one consortium school and really love it from applying to a second consortium school? I I've had this thought before, and I've had this conversation with students
Hmm.
where, let's say, they love Pomona, they
Hmm.
kind of like Pitzer, they want to apply to both. In a vacuum, they would apply to both. But I imagine this eventuality where, let's say, you get into Pitzer, you don't get into Pomona. How does it feel to be a student at Pitzer when Pomona is right over there, a stone's throw away, and you're not actually a part of that community in the way that you'd hoped? Do you ever talk to students about that or counsel about how that's going to feel when they make their final choice?
That's an interesting question. I haven't had that specific situation. Um, the only time that I've experienced that kind of tangentially was students who would apply to both Swarthmore and Haverford,
Hmm.
and felt like one was the first choice, the other was a second choice. And the interesting thing was, and I can only think of like one particular case where the student was applying to both and hoping to get into Swarthmore, but Haverford would be that second option. That because they didn't get that first option, they chose not to exercise either. And so I think that when you feel like that primary option is closed, um, it's kind of like being taken off the wait list in June. You have
Yeah,
a lot of students who are kind of feel like, yeah, I was excited last month, but now I'm kind of not, right?
right.
And so I think that set of options that felt clear in the application stage tends to fade in the reality stage of, is this really going to work for me?
Yeah, and I think we see similar kinds of things with a student that maybe applies for a first choice major at a university and then they get admitted to the university, but not for that major. And then the question becomes, do I actually want to be here if I can't be an engineering major?
Exactly.
Tough question, I think. And I
Yeah.
think it's not, I'm not being totally fair to Pitzer in this example. I'm prioritizing Pomona because that was the school
Mhm,
that I was really interested in. But
mhm,
Pitzer would say, look, we've got a great community of students and we're really talented in our own right in terms of the kind of experience that we have to offer.
mhm.
Um, are there any other things that you would say that students should pay particular attention to in the research phase as they're maybe investigating some of these consortium colleges?
Well, yeah, like I said, these are kind of the when people, especially in admissions, think about consortiums. These are probably the top three that come to mind. But
Right.
there's the Atlanta Consortium. There's others
Yeah.
that are similar, and I think that as students are thinking about um, the sharing of these resources, I think it's a really good idea for them when they're on campus, and hopefully they do have the opportunity to go to campus, to really ask those types of questions about how accessible is this really,
Yeah.
right? And what are the advantages in terms of my particular interests? Is it just co-curricular? Is it just activities that I can do on those campuses? Is it primarily social? What are the things that I hope to get out of that type of relationship? And what is the actuality of that? And I've talked to Amherst students who say, we don't really participate in a lot of, what the consortium offers. We kind of feel like we have everything we need right here.
Sure.
So there isn't as much interchange on the Amherst College campus as there might be on some of the others.
Right.
So I think it really depends upon what the students' interests are in those member colleges and making sure that they are going to get the type of experience they want from their home college as well as those consortium options as well.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you mentioned also the Atlanta Consortium. I was doing some research in advance of this segment, and it really looks like what's interesting about that Atlanta Consortium, which includes Clark, Atlanta, Morehouse, and Spelman, and also the Morehouse School of Medicine. So historically Black colleges and universities. What I
Mhm,
really liked about what I was reading there is that it felt like it was building that community, developing those sort of connections to the roots of that place in Atlanta. And you can
mhm,
imagine that some of the value of that consortium might even obtain after graduation, where you're a part of this collective, this consortium. Hey, you went to Spelman, I went to Morehouse, and there's an opportunity to leverage that for a professional network on into the future. So, sometimes students are really thinking about the day to day of going to classes and where am I going to
mhm.
register and what I'm going to take. But I think that these consortiums are also well situated to say, hey, we've just quadrupled your alumni network by being a part of this organization, and that can create some really interesting and exciting opportunities for you.
Absolutely
Um,
true.
so this is great. I mean, just in having this segment today, I learned a little bit about some of these different consortiums, and I think
Mhm,
that they're really appealing for students, and it's worth having a look. So thanks,
absolutely.
Kenan, for coming in and talking through this with us.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, when we come back, we're going to start to talk about what seniors need to be doing as next steps as they are making their final decision. So if you've got a senior at home and you're starting to think about where you're going to put in that enrollment deposit, you won't want to miss that next segment. We'll be right back.